She didn't leave because she stopped caring. She left because something inside her mind started shifting before you even noticed. And here's what most men never understand. Attraction doesn't disappear overnight, it slowly detaches in silence. The texts slow down, the energy changes, the replies become colder, but the real decision is already made deep in her subconscious. And the shocking truth is, when a woman leaves, it's rarely the beginning of the end. It's the result of emotional patterns that we're building for weeks. But what if I told you? In many cases, she doesn't fully let go the way you think she does. She didn't just wake up one day and decide to leave. That's the illusion most men hold on to when they try to make sense of emotional distance. In reality, something much quieter was happening long before the ending ever arrived. Attraction doesn't collapse in a single moment. It fades through subtle emotional shifts that most people overlook while they're busy believing everything is still fine. At the beginning, connection feels effortless. There is curiosity, excitement, and emotional presence. But human psychology is wired to respond to change, not repetition. When emotional experiences become predictable, the mind starts to disengage. Not because something is wrong, but because novelty is one of the strongest drivers of attention and emotional intensity. And when that novelty slowly disappears, so does the unconscious pull that once made everything feel alive. What makes this process difficult to recognize is that emotional withdrawal rarely starts on the outside. It begins internally, in thought patterns that quietly change. A person may still laugh, still reply, still show up, but something subtle shifts in how they feel while doing it. The emotional weight is no longer the same. Psychology shows that decisions are often formed emotionally first and only later justified logically. So by the time distance becomes visible, the internal decision has often already been written. There is also a deeper layer most people miss, the way the mind evaluates emotional leadership. In any connection, consciously or not, people look for stability in presence, clarity in intention, and consistency in emotional energy. When that becomes inconsistent, the subconscious starts recalibrating attachment. Not as punishment, but as self-protection. The mind is always trying to reduce uncertainty, and when it finds emotional unpredictability, it slowly detaches to regain balance. And then comes silence, not always as rejection, but as processing. When emotions become overloaded or unclear, the mind doesn't immediately respond with closure. It retreats. It reorganizes feelings in the background, trying to make sense of what is still emotionally valuable and what no longer feels aligned. To the other person, this silence feels like distance. But internally, it is often a negotiation between memory and emotion. Because attachment is not just about the person, it is about how that person makes someone feel over time. The human brain stores emotional impressions more strongly than factual experiences. This is why one strong emotional shift can outweigh months of stability. When feelings change, perception changes with them, even if the external reality looks the same. But here is where psychology becomes even more complex. Letting go outwardly does not always mean letting go inwardly. Emotional memory does not delete itself instantly. It lingers in fragments, moments, sensations, familiar triggers that can resurface without warning. This is why distance can exist, yet emotional echoes still remain in the background of the mind. And perhaps the most important realization in all of this is that attraction and disconnection are not purely logical events. They are psychological processes shaped by attention, emotion, and internal meaning. When someone pulls away, it is rarely about a single action. It is the result of repeated emotional interpretations that gradually shift how the mind perceives connection. Understanding this doesn't change the past, but it changes awareness. It reveals that human behavior is far more internal than it appears on the surface, and most endings are not sudden. They are built quietly in the mind, long before they are ever expressed in reality. And sometimes, the deepest understanding is simply this: nothing changes overnight. It never happens the way most people imagine. There is no single argument, no dramatic moment, no clear ending that signals this is where it changed. Instead, emotional disconnection begins silently, long before anything is said out loud. What looks sudden on the surface is usually the result of weeks, or sometimes even longer, of internal processing that no one else can see. In human psychology, emotional processing does not require permission or announcement. The mind works privately, constantly evaluating experiences, comparing feelings, and adjusting attachment levels based on repeated emotional patterns. So while a conversation might still feel normal on the outside, something inside the other person may already be shifting in how it interprets that connection. At first, the signs are almost invisible. A slight reduction in excitement, a delay in emotional response, less curiosity in conversations that once felt engaging. These are not conscious decisions, they are subconscious recalibrations. The brain is always trying to determine emotional safety, consistency, and fulfillment. And when something begins to feel emotionally unbalanced, it doesn't immediately end the connection. It studies it first. This is where most misunderstandings begin. Because one person is still emotionally present, while the other is already transitioning into observation mode. They are no longer fully inside the experience. They are analyzing it from a slight emotional distance. Not because they want to hurt anyone, but because the mind naturally starts detaching when emotional patterns no longer feel aligned with inner expectations. Psychologically, this internal shift is often driven by accumulation rather than events. It's not one thing that causes disconnection. It's many small emotional moments that didn't feel fully resolved. A feeling of being unheard, a lack of emotional depth in certain moments, or repeated experiences that slowly change how safe or valued someone feels. Over time, the mind begins to store these experiences not as separate incidents, but as a pattern. And once the brain recognizes a pattern, it starts predicting the future based on it. This is where emotional detachment quietly begins. The person may still smile, still engage, still respond, but internally, their emotional investment is no longer growing in the same direction. It is either plateauing or slowly decreasing. What makes this process even more complex is that people often try to fix what they can see, not what is actually happening. They respond to distance only when it becomes visible. But emotional disconnection does not start with distance. It starts with interpretation. The way the mind begins to interpret emotional experiences differently is the real turning point. There is also a protective mechanism involved. The human mind is designed to avoid emotional discomfort. So when a connection starts to feel uncertain or emotionally inconsistent, the subconscious doesn't wait for confirmation. It begins preparing for detachment. This is not a decision made in logic, but in emotional self-preservation. And by the time someone finally expresses that they feel different, they are often describing something that started long ago inside their own thoughts. The delay between internal realization and external expression is what makes it so confusing for the other person. One side is speaking from a recent moment, while the other is speaking from a long internal timeline. This is why emotional awareness matters so deeply, because what feels sudden is rarely sudden. It is a quiet internal journey that reaches the surface only when it has already been completed inside the mind. And once the mind finishes its conclusion, words are just the final echo. It's easy to believe that attraction is something stable, something that either exists or disappears. But psychology tells a very different story. Attraction is not a fixed state. It is a constantly evolving emotional response shaped by perception, behavior, and internal interpretation. And one of the most overlooked forces inside this process is emotional leadership. At a subconscious level, the human mind is always scanning for emotional structure. It may not be logical or spoken, but it is deeply felt. People are drawn to energy that feels grounded, intentional, and emotionally consistent. Not because they consciously demand it, but because the nervous system naturally feels safer around it. Stability signals predictability, and predictability reduces emotional tension. When emotional leadership is present, it creates a quiet sense of direction in the connection. There is clarity in behavior, consistency in emotional tone, and a feeling that things are not chaotic or confusing. This does not mean perfection. It means emotional steadiness. And the subconscious mind interprets this as reliability, which strengthens attachment over time. But when emotional energy becomes inconsistent, something subtle begins to shift internally. It may not be noticed immediately, but the mind starts registering uncertainty. One day the energy feels strong, the next day it feels distant. One moment there is emotional clarity, and the next there is confusion. The brain does not ignore these patterns, it analyzes them. And here is where psychology becomes interesting. The subconscious does not evaluate based on isolated moments. It evaluates based on emotional trends. If the trend feels unstable, the mind begins to reduce emotional investment, not as punishment, but as protection. Because uncertainty, when repeated, creates internal discomfort, and the mind is always trying to minimize that discomfort. This is why emotional consistency often matters more than intensity. Intensity creates sparks, but consistency builds trust. And trust is the foundation of long-term emotional attachment. Without it, attraction becomes fragile, easily influenced by external changes or internal doubts. There is also another layer most people don't see: the perception of emotional direction. People are naturally drawn to individuals who seem to be emotionally moving forward in life, people who have purpose, clarity, and inner momentum. This creates an unconscious impression of strength, not dominance, but direction. and direction signals stability to the mind. When that sense of direction becomes unclear, when emotional energy feels scattered or reactive, the subconscious starts to reevaluate its attachment. Not because attraction is gone, but because the emotional framework that supported it feels less secure. The mind begins asking silent questions. Where is this going emotionally? Is this stable? Does this feel aligned anymore? These questions are not verbal, they are felt. And over time, they shape emotional response more than any single event ever could. What makes this even more powerful is that emotional leadership is not about controlling the other person. It is about managing one's own internal state. The subconscious is highly sensitive to emotional regulation. When someone remains centered even during uncertainty, it creates psychological grounding in the connection. But when emotional reactions become unpredictable, the sense of stability weakens. And once that internal stability weakens, attraction does not instantly disappear. It becomes unanchored. It loses its depth, not because of a lack of feeling, but because the emotional environment that supported it is no longer consistent. This is the part most people misunderstand. They try to increase effort, increase communication, increase presence, but attraction is not always built through more action. Sometimes it is built through emotional alignment, clarity, and internal steadiness. Because in the end, the subconscious mind is not just reacting to what is said or done. It is reacting to how safe, clear, and emotionally structured the experience feels over time. And when that structure changes, attraction quietly changes with it. Silence is one of the most misunderstood phases in human connection. On the surface, it looks like distance, rejection, or emotional closure. But psychologically, silence is rarely that simple. It is often a state of internal processing where the mind is trying to reorganize emotional data that has become too heavy, too confusing, or too emotionally charged to respond to immediately. When emotions reach a certain level of complexity, the brain does not always respond with words. Instead, it withdraws, not to end the connection, but to reduce internal overload. This is a natural psychological defense mechanism. The nervous system, when overwhelmed, seeks stillness before clarity, and silence becomes that stillness. During this phase, something important is happening internally that is not visible from the outside. The mind is replaying emotional experiences, comparing past feelings with current ones, and trying to understand what still feels aligned and what no longer fits the emotional pattern it once recognized. This is not a quick process. It is layered, nonlinear, and deeply subconscious. To the other person, this silence often feels like being pushed away. But internally, it is more like emotional recalibration. The brain is not rejecting connection immediately. It is testing emotional memory against present reality. It is asking, without words, whether the emotional bond still feels stable, safe, and meaningful enough to continue engaging with. Psychologically, silence also acts as a buffer between emotional intensity and decision making. Humans do not make their clearest emotional decisions in the middle of overwhelm. Instead, the mind steps back to create distance so it can evaluate without pressure. That distance is silence. And within that space, emotional clarity slowly begins to form. But what makes silence so complex is that it can be interpreted in multiple ways depending on emotional perspective. For one person, it may feel like abandonment. For the other, it may feel like necessary space. Neither interpretation is fully wrong, but both are incomplete if they ignore the internal psychological process behind it. There is also a deeper subconscious mechanism at play, emotional sorting. When the mind is uncertain, it begins categorizing experiences into emotional value: what feels safe, what feels draining, what feels meaningful, and what feels uncertain. Silence becomes the environment where this sorting happens without external influence. No new input, no pressure, just internal reflection. And during this time, memory plays a powerful role. The brain does not store experiences as isolated events, it stores them as emotional impressions. So when silence begins, the mind does not only think about recent moments, it pulls up the emotional history of the entire connection. Every interaction, every feeling, every unresolved emotional signal gets reprocessed in a quieter mental space. This is why silence can feel so heavy even when nothing is being said. Because in reality, a lot is happening internally. The absence of communication does not mean absence of thought. In fact, it often means the opposite. The mind becomes more active in silence because it is no longer distracted by external interaction. Over time, this internal processing leads to emotional clarity, not always in favor of continuation, and not always in favor of ending, but in favor of understanding. The mind eventually reaches a point where it can define what the connection means in its current emotional state, not just its past emotional experience. And once that clarity is formed internally, silence begins to shift. Either it transforms into reconnection with renewed emotional alignment, or it becomes a quiet transition into distance that no longer needs explanation. But until that moment arrives, silence is not emptiness. It is processing, reflection, and emotional reorganization happening beneath the surface where no words are needed. People often believe attachment is tied directly to the person in front of them, but psychology reveals something far more subtle and powerful. Human beings are not just attached to individuals, they are attached to emotional experiences, to how someone makes them feel, how their nervous system responds in their presence, and the internal emotional states that are activated through repeated interaction. This means attraction is less about physical presence and more about emotional imprinting. The brain records feelings more strongly than facts. So when someone enters our emotional world, they don't just become a person. We associate them with a specific emotional frequency: comfort, excitement, safety, uncertainty, validation, or confusion. Over time, that emotional pattern becomes the real anchor of attachment. This is why two people can experience the same relationship completely differently. One may feel deeply connected, while the other is gradually detaching, because their internal emotional interpretations are not identical. Each person's mind is constantly building its own emotional narrative based on what it consistently feels, not just what is happening externally. And here is where subconscious behavior becomes extremely important. The human mind is always trying to predict emotional outcomes based on past patterns. If a certain interaction repeatedly creates emotional tension, inconsistency, or unmet expectations, the brain begins to associate that connection with emotional effort rather than emotional reward. And once that association forms, attraction starts to shift. Not suddenly, but gradually. On the other hand, when a connection consistently creates emotional safety, clarity, and positive reinforcement, the brain strengthens its attachment to that emotional state. It begins to seek more of it, not because of logic, but because the nervous system prefers familiar emotional comfort. This is how emotional bonding deepens over time. But what most people miss is that emotional perception is not fixed. It changes with internal state. A person who is stressed, emotionally overwhelmed, or mentally distracted will not interpret the same interaction the same way as when they are calm and balanced. This is why timing, emotional readiness, and internal mindset play such a powerful role in attraction dynamics. There is also a hidden psychological truth. People rarely leave because of one moment. They leave because their emotional experience has been gradually reshaped. What once felt exciting may start to feel draining. What once felt meaningful may begin to feel inconsistent. The emotional meaning attached to the connection slowly changes in the subconscious mind. And once emotional meaning changes, perception follows. The same person is no longer experienced in the same way, even if nothing externally has changed. This is because the brain prioritizes emotional interpretation over objective reality. It reacts to how something feels, not just what it is. Another key aspect is emotional memory. The mind does not only remember events, it remembers emotional intensity. Moments of high emotional impact are stored more deeply and can override many smaller positive experiences. This is why a few emotionally significant negative experiences can shift attraction more strongly than many neutral or positive ones. However, emotional memory also works in the opposite direction. Strong positive emotional experiences can remain embedded long after physical distance occurs. This is why people sometimes think they have moved on, yet still feel emotional echoes when reminded of certain moments or feelings. This is where the idea of letting go becomes more complex than it appears. Outward behavior does not always reflect internal emotional processing. A person may move away physically while still carrying emotional traces internally. The subconscious does not delete emotional experiences instantly. It gradually rewires them over time. So attachment is not just about staying or leaving. It is about the emotional patterns that have been built inside the mind. And those patterns continue to exist even after the visible connection changes. In the end, what we call attraction is really the mind's response to emotional meaning. And that meaning is constantly being shaped, reshaped, and reinterpreted in ways most people never consciously notice. One of the deepest misunderstandings about human emotion is the belief that distance automatically means detachment. People assume that once someone walks away, stops communicating, or creates space, the emotional connection disappears with it. But the human mind does not work that cleanly. Emotion is not controlled like a switch. It lingers, reshapes itself, hides in memory, and sometimes survives long after the connection itself changes form. Psychology shows that the brain is deeply influenced by emotional imprinting. When someone becomes emotionally significant, they are not stored in the mind as simple memories. They become associated with emotional states, routines, sensations, and subconscious patterns. This is why certain people remain mentally present even in physical absence. The mind remembers how they felt, not just who they were. And this is where emotional distance becomes complicated. Because externally, someone may appear completely detached. They may stop reaching out, stop expressing emotions, or move forward with life. But internally, the subconscious mind can still be carrying unresolved emotional traces. Not because the person wants to hold on intentionally, but because emotional memory fades much slower than physical presence. The brain is designed to preserve emotionally significant experiences, especially experiences tied to strong emotional intensity. Love, rejection, longing, excitement, emotional safety. These feelings create deeper neural associations than ordinary moments. And once those emotional associations are formed repeatedly, they do not disappear instantly when the relationship changes. This is why certain memories return unexpectedly. A place, a song, a specific phrase, even a familiar silence can reactivate emotional patterns stored deep in the subconscious. The person may believe they have fully moved on, but suddenly the nervous system responds before logic even has time to react. Because emotional memory is not purely intellectual, it is biological. There is also another hidden psychological truth. The mind often idealizes emotional absence. When someone is no longer constantly available, the brain fills empty space with selective emotional memories. It starts replaying emotionally intense moments while minimizing ordinary or negative ones. This is not always conscious. It is the brain trying to make emotional sense of loss and attachment. And sometimes, distance creates clarity that closeness could not. When emotions are no longer clouded by constant interaction, the mind begins to evaluate the connection differently. Certain feelings become stronger in absence because the emotional noise is gone. What was once taken for granted suddenly becomes emotionally visible. But this does not always lead to reconnection. Sometimes it simply creates emotional awareness. The realization that feelings were deeper than they originally appeared. The understanding that emotional bonds do not disappear just because communication stops. This is why human attachment is so psychologically complex. A person can move on behaviorally while still carrying emotional residue internally. They can build a new routine while occasionally revisiting old emotional patterns in silence. The subconscious mind does not erase attachment linearly. It slowly rewires itself through time, repetition, and emotional replacement. And perhaps the most mysterious part of all this is that people are often unaware of how much emotion they still carry until something unexpectedly triggers it. A memory resurfaces, an emotion returns, a familiar feeling appears without warning. Not because the past is still alive in reality, but because parts of it are still alive psychologically. This is why closure is rarely as final as people pretend it is. Human emotions are layered, contradictory, and deeply tied to memory. Someone can choose distance and still feel emotional connection. They can let go physically while part of the subconscious still remembers what that connection once meant. Because in the end, people do not always return physically. But emotionally, some connections never leave completely.